It was a quiet evening at Le Chandelier, an upscale restaurant in New York City known for its elegance and discreet clientele. The soft murmur of conversations and the occasional clink of silverware filled the air. At a corner table, Oliver Reed, the man who had revolutionized the tech world with his innovations, sat alone. His sharp blue eyes scanned the menu, though his mind seemed elsewhere. The weight of his success had never quite outweighed the sorrow that lingered in his heart. It had been 5 years since Victoria, his wife, had passed away in a tragic accident. 5 years since his world had changed. He glanced at the empty chair across from him, remembering how she used to sit there, her laughter mingling with the ambient music. Now, there was only silence. As he raised his hand to signal for a waiter, something caught his attention, a figure moving between the tables. His breath hitched. For a moment, it felt as if the world stopped. Victoria? The name barely escaped his lips. Standing a few feet away, balancing a tray of drinks, was a young waitress who looked exactly like her. Her hair, her eyes, even the delicate way she moved. It was as if his wife had come back to life. His pulse quickened as he stared at her, unable to tear his gaze away. She hadn't noticed him yet, but when she finally turned in his direction, their eyes locked. Isabella Clark, a 23-year-old working her third shift at the restaurant, noticed the intense gaze from the sharply dressed man in the corner. She smiled politely, used to the lingering stares from wealthy patrons, but something in his expression made her pause. It wasn't the typical look she got from customers. There was confusion, shock, and something else she couldn't quite place. Oliver's mind raced. How was this possible? He hadn't seen anyone who resembled Victoria since the day she died. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, drawing the attention of nearby diners. Isabella's smile faltered. "Is something wrong, sir?" she asked, her voice calm but cautious as she approached his table. Oliver struggled to find his words. It was uncanny, the resemblance was too close to be a coincidence. His heart hammered in his chest as he whispered, "You look exactly like someone I knew." Isabella tilted her head slightly, confused but maintaining her professional composure. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't think we've met before." He blinked, shaking his head to clear the overwhelming flood of memories. "No, we haven't. But you?" His voice trailed off as he studied her face, looking for any difference, any sign that this wasn't some strange mirage. But there was none. The resemblance was almost eerie. "I apologize," Oliver said, finally composing himself. "You just reminded me of someone. Someone very important to me." Isabella nodded, though the intensity of the moment left her feeling uneasy. "If there's anything I can get for you, sir, please let me know," she said, backing away slightly, hoping to diffuse the strange energy. Oliver sat down again, but his mind was far from settled. As she moved on to another table, he couldn't help but watch her. She looked so much like Victoria that it was impossible to ignore. The way her hair caught the light, the delicate curve of her jawline, even her smile. It was as if Victoria was right there, alive and well. For the rest of the evening, Oliver remained distracted. Every time Isabella passed by, he found himself studying her, comparing every feature to his late wife. Memories of his life with Victoria came flooding back, each one more vivid than the last. Could it be? The thought gnawed at him. Could this young woman somehow be connected to Victoria? But how? As the evening wound down, Oliver knew he couldn't leave without speaking to her again. There was something he needed to understand. When she came by to clear his table, he asked, "Isabella, right?" She looked up, startled that he remembered her name. "Yes, sir. Is there anything else I can do for you?" Oliver hesitated. "Forgive me for asking, but have you ever been told you look like someone else?" Isabella smiled faintly, not the first time she had heard such a comment. "A few times, yes. Some people say I remind them of someone, but no one specific." He nodded, but the answer only deepened his curiosity. "May I ask, where are you from?" Isabella frowned slightly, sensing the oddness of the question. "I was adopted, sir. I've lived in New York most of my life." Oliver's heart skipped a beat. Adopted? He tried to hide his sudden rush of emotions, but it was clear something had changed in him. "I see. I'm sorry if this is too personal," he began. But do you know anything about your biological parents? Isabella hesitated. No, not really. I never looked into it. She felt the conversation teetering on the edge of something she didn't quite understand. Why was he so interested in her past? Thank you, Oliver said abruptly, sensing her discomfort. I didn't mean to intrude, but the moment she walked away, he knew he wouldn't be able to let it go. There was something here, something he needed to uncover. And as he watched Isabella disappear into the kitchen, a question burned in his mind. Could this young woman be his daughter? Oliver couldn't sleep that night. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Isabella Clarke and the undeniable resemblance she bore to Victoria. It wasn't just a passing similarity. It was as if she had stepped straight out of his memories, leaving him grappling with emotions he had long since buried. The next morning, he found himself sitting at his office desk, the sprawling skyline of New York framed by the glass windows behind him. Yet, his focus wasn't on the pile of contracts that needed signing or the calls he was expected to make. Instead, he was fixated on a single thought. Isabella. Was it possible? Could she really be connected to Victoria? And what did she mean when she said she was adopted? That single detail gnawed at him, pushing him to act on the growing suspicion in his mind. Oliver leaned forward, dialing a number from memory. The line clicked after a few rings. James, it's Oliver, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Oliver, been a while, replied James Porter, a private investigator Oliver had used in the past. What can I do for you? I need you to look into someone for me, Oliver began, pacing the room. Her name is Isabella Clarke. She works at Le Chandelier, a restaurant downtown. Find out everything you can about her, especially her background, her adoption, and her family history. Discreetly. James hesitated for a moment, sensing the gravity in Oliver's tone. Understood. I'll get back to you as soon as I have something. Oliver hung up the phone, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. He knew he was about to open a door that could lead to revelations he wasn't prepared for, but the need to know was stronger than his fear. Days passed, each one filled with an agonizing wait for James's report. In the meantime, Oliver found himself returning to Le Chandelier more than once, his presence becoming a regular part of the restaurant's quiet evenings. Each time, he would take his usual seat, observing Isabella from afar, watching her move about the room, still in disbelief over the resemblance. During one of these visits, Isabella approached his table again, her expression cautious yet polite. Good evening, Mr. Reed, she greeted him, her voice as calm and professional as ever. Back again? Oliver offered a small smile, though his mind was miles away. It's hard to stay away from such a place. His eyes lingered on her face, trying to remain subtle, but the weight of his thoughts slipped into his voice. Can I ask you something, Isabella? She paused, her hands clasping the edge of the tray she carried. Of course. Your adoption, he began carefully, not wanting to scare her off. Have you ever wanted to know more about your biological family? Isabella blinked, surprised by the personal question, but something in Oliver's tone kept her from brushing it off. She had grown accustomed to him over the past few nights, the way he would sit alone, always watching her as if trying to solve a puzzle. This question felt like a continuation of that strange energy between them. Honestly, she admitted, shifting her weight slightly, I've thought about it, sure, but I never knew where to start, and I'm not even sure if I want to open that chapter of my life. My adoptive parents were good to me. I never really felt like I was missing anything. Oliver nodded, but inside, his heart was racing. Good parents or not, there were still answers that needed to be uncovered. And those answers might explain why she looked so much like Victoria. I see, he said softly, his mind spinning with possibilities. Is there a reason you're asking me this? Isabella questioned, her curiosity now piqued. Oliver had been mysterious before, but now there was something about his questioning that felt far more personal. He hesitated. Should he tell her what he suspected? Should he share the thoughts that had been haunting him since the moment he laid eyes on her? No, not yet. Not until he was sure. Let's just say, I've known someone who looked a lot like you, he finally replied, choosing his words with caution. And it made me curious. That's all. Isabella didn't seem convinced, but she nodded, sensing there was more behind his question than he was letting on. "Well, if I ever decide to look into it, I'll let you know," she said lightly before excusing herself to tend to another table. Oliver watched her go, his mind already miles ahead, plotting the next steps. He would find out the truth, one way or another. A week later, as Oliver sat in his office once again, the phone rang. He snatched it up immediately, recognizing the number. "James, I've got something for you," James said, his tone clipped and professional. "It wasn't easy, but I found some details about Isabella's adoption. She was born in upstate New York, but there's not much on her biological parents. No names listed on the original birth certificate, which is unusual. It seems the adoption was handled through private channels. And there's more." Oliver's pulse quickened. "Go on." "There are discrepancies in the paperwork. Some records are missing, and others seem deliberately redacted. It's like someone wanted to cover something up." Oliver's grip tightened on the phone. A cover-up? His mind raced through the possibilities. Could Victoria have kept something from him before she died? Something about a child they never spoke of? "What else did you find?" Oliver asked, his voice now a mix of urgency and dread. "I'm still digging, but if you want my opinion," James paused for a moment, as if choosing his next words carefully. "This isn't just a simple adoption. Someone went to great lengths to hide the details of Isabella's past." Oliver's mind reeled. The possibility that had been simmering in the back of his mind now seemed closer than ever. Could Isabella be his daughter? Could Victoria have hidden a pregnancy from him, fearing the consequences or some other danger? "Keep looking," Oliver ordered, his voice resolute. "I need to know everything." After hanging up, Oliver sat in silence, staring at the skyline of New York City. The life he had built, the man he had become, had all been shaped by loss, by the hole Victoria's death had left in his heart. But now, a new question consumed him. Had he lost a daughter too? The weight of the possible truth pressed down on him. He had to know, and soon. Isabella had never been one to dwell on her past. Growing up, her adoptive parents had provided her with a loving home, and though she had always known she was adopted, the lack of information about her biological family hadn't bothered her until now. The encounter with Oliver Reed, the intense way he had looked at her, the probing questions about her adoption, they all left her unsettled. His sudden curiosity about her origins ignited something inside her that she had long suppressed. For the first time, Isabella found herself wondering about her birth parents in a way that felt urgent, as though discovering the truth was no longer a choice, but a necessity. She sat at her small kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Outside, the steady hum of New York's bustling streets was a comforting background to her racing thoughts. Normally, this was the time she used to relax before heading to work, but today her mind was a million miles away. Oliver's words echoed in her head. "Have you ever wanted to know more about your biological family?" Isabella took a deep breath, her eyes drifting to the envelope on the table. It contained the few documents her adoptive parents had been able to give her over the years. She had looked at them only once, years ago, but now, the envelope felt heavier, as if it held the key to something she had unknowingly been searching for all her life. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the paper. Finally, with a deep breath, she opened it and began to sift through the contents. A birth certificate, her name listed simply as baby girl, no parents named. Then, there was a note from the adoption agency, a short letter from her adoptive parents explaining how much they had wanted her, and not much else. There were no clues, no leads, just a void where her history should have been. Frustrated, she tossed the papers back onto the table and buried her face in her hands. Why did it matter now? Why was she suddenly obsessed with finding answers she hadn't cared about before? And why did Oliver Reed, of all people, have anything to do with it? Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from the restaurant manager reminding her about her upcoming shift. Isabella sighed. The last thing she wanted was to face Oliver again tonight, but she couldn't avoid him forever. Oliver, meanwhile, had spent the entire day pacing his office, waiting for James to call with more information. His mind was in turmoil, torn between the desperation for answers and the dread of what those answers might mean. Could Isabella really be his daughter? And if so, how could Victoria have kept this from him? The more Oliver thought about it, the more certain he became that something had been hidden from him. Something that had been lurking just beneath the surface of his marriage with Victoria. He had always sensed there was more to the tragedy of her death, more than just the accident that had taken her life. But now, this mystery, this young woman who looked so much like her, it had opened up old wounds he hadn't even realized were still there. His phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. It was James. "I've got more," James said without preamble. "It's not good." Oliver's heart raced. "What did you find?" "There's no direct connection between you and Isabella. Not yet, anyway. But there's something strange in the adoption records. I found out that her biological mother gave birth under a different name, one that doesn't match any legal records. It's like she was trying to disappear." Disappear? Oliver's stomach churned. "Yeah. The adoption was done through private channels, like I mentioned before. Everything was kept off the books. If I had to guess, someone wanted to make sure that Isabella's biological origins were impossible to trace." Oliver's mind reeled. What if Victoria had been trying to protect her? What if she had been forced to give up their child for some reason, maybe to keep them both safe? The pieces were there, but they were still too scattered for him to see the full picture. "I need you to dig deeper," Oliver said, his voice firm. "I need to know why this was done. And if there's any connection to Victoria, I want you to find it." "Understood," James replied before hanging up. Oliver sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the city skyline. The more he uncovered, the more tangled the mystery became. But now, more than ever, he was determined to find out the truth. If Isabella was his daughter, he had to know. And if she wasn't, he still needed to understand why she looked so much like Victoria. There had to be an explanation. Later that evening, Isabella returned to Lou's Chandelier for her shift. As she tied on her apron, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. She knew Oliver would be there. He had been coming in almost every night since their strange conversation, and each time, she felt his eyes on her, as if he was searching for something. Sure enough, when she entered the main dining area, there he was, seated in his usual corner table, his gaze already following her. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the other customers, taking orders, refilling drinks. But each time she passed by Oliver's table, she could feel his presence, like an unspoken question that hung in the air between them. Finally, as the night wore on and the restaurant began to quiet down, Isabella couldn't take it anymore. She approached his table, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the check down in front of him. "Is there something you're not telling me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Oliver looked up at her, startled by the directness of her question. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He hadn't expected her to confront him so openly. "There's something you're not saying," Isabella pressed, her eyes searching his face. "You keep asking me about my adoption, about my family. What is it you're really after?" Oliver took a deep breath, knowing the moment had come. He had to tell her something. He couldn't keep skirting around the truth, not when the stakes were this high. "I think," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I think you might be connected to someone I once knew. Someone very important to me." Isabella frowned. "Who?" "My wife," Oliver said, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. "Victoria." Isabella blinked, confused. "Your wife? What does she have to do with me?" Oliver's gaze didn't waver. "You look exactly like her. More than that, I think you might be her daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in slowly, like a stone dropping into deep water. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "I don't understand," she finally said, her voice shaking. "You think I'm your daughter?" Oliver nodded slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't know for sure, but I think it's possible. That's why I've been asking about your adoption. There are things that don't add up. Things that make me believe you might be connected to Victoria. And to me." Isabella felt the room spin around her, her thoughts spiraling out of control. This couldn't be happening. It didn't make any sense. Her adoptive parents had never told her anything like this. How could she possibly be the daughter of this stranger? "I need time to think," she whispered, backing away from the table. Oliver's expression softened, understanding the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "But please, don't walk away from this. We need to find out the truth." Isabella didn't reply. She turned and walked quickly toward the kitchen, her heart racing, her mind reeling with questions she had never imagined asking. The kitchen doors swung shut behind Isabella as she stumbled into the back of the restaurant, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion. She gripped the edge of a countertop, her knuckles turning white as she tried to steady herself. Her heart was racing, her thoughts a tangled mess. How could this be real? How could a man like Oliver Reed, a stranger, claim to be her father? She didn't want to believe it, but something about the way he spoke, the certainty in his eyes, had shaken her to her core. The resemblance between her and his wife, Victoria, was undeniable, even to her. She had always brushed off the occasional comments about looking like someone people had known, but now it seemed like more than a coincidence. And the strange details of her adoption, the gaps, the missing information, she had always known something wasn't quite right, but she had never pressed for answers. Now it felt like those unanswered questions were crashing down around her all at once. She leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes, trying to block out the noise of the kitchen staff and the steady clatter of dishes being cleaned. But even in the darkness behind her eyelids, all she could see was Oliver's face. The way he had looked at her, almost as if he was seeing a ghost. And the words he had spoken kept replaying in her mind. "You might be her daughter." Daughter. The word felt foreign, alien. She had never even entertained the idea that her birth parents might still be out there, let alone someone as powerful and wealthy as Oliver Reed. It didn't fit into the life she had known, the life she had built for herself as the adopted daughter of a middle-class family. She didn't want it to fit, but deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. Isabella? The voice of her coworker, Jen, cut through her spiraling thoughts. "You okay?" Isabella opened her eyes and saw Jen standing in front of her, a concerned expression on her face. She forced a smile, trying to mask the chaos swirling inside her. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a long night." Jen nodded, but didn't look convinced. "If you need to take a break, I can cover for you." Isabella shook her head. "No, I'm good. Thanks, though." As Jen walked away, Isabella took a deep breath and tried to collect herself. She still had a job to do, and she couldn't afford to let her emotions get the better of her. Not now. She wiped her hands on her apron and forced herself to go back out into the dining room, but she avoided Oliver's table, focusing instead on the other customers who needed her attention. By the time the restaurant closed for the night, Isabella felt like she was running on autopilot. She went through the motions of cleaning up, chatting briefly with the other staff, but her mind was elsewhere. As she left the restaurant and stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a strange sense of disconnection from everything around her. The busy city streets, the honking of taxis, the laughter of people spilling out of bars, it all felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. She started walking, her footsteps quick and determined, though she wasn't sure where she was going. She needed space, somewhere to think, somewhere to make sense of what Oliver had told her. Her feet led her to Central Park, where the quiet paths and the occasional flicker of lamplight seemed to offer some kind of solace. Sitting down on a bench, she pulled her coat tighter around her and stared up at the sky. The stars were faint, barely visible against the haze of city lights, but they were there. She remembered how her adoptive mother used to tell her that the stars were like family members, always watching over you, even if you couldn't see them clearly. But what if the family she had believed in all her life wasn't her real family? What if everything she thought she knew about herself was a lie? Isabella reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She hesitated for a moment, then scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for her adoptive mother. Her finger hovered over the call button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. What would she say? How could she even begin to explain what had just happened? She tucked the phone away again, feeling a pang of guilt. Her parents had always been good to her. They had given her everything, and she loved them deeply. But now, with the possibility that her birth parents might still be out there, that she might have a whole other life she never knew about, she felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Not towards them, but towards herself. for never asking the questions that now seemed so important. And then there was Oliver. Why had he waited so long to say something? If he truly believed she was his daughter, why hadn't he come forward sooner? And what about his wife, Victoria? Was it possible that this woman, this stranger she had never known, was her biological mother? The more Isabella thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit, but it also left her with more questions than answers. She knew one thing for sure. She couldn't leave things unresolved. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next morning, Isabella found herself standing outside a small, unassuming building on the Upper East Side. It was an adoption agency, a place she had never thought she would need to visit. She had called ahead, made an appointment, and now here she was, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared up at the building's plain facade. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet, almost sterile. A receptionist smiled at her from behind a desk, motioning for her to take a seat. Isabella's hands shook as she sat down, waiting for her name to be called. She couldn't believe she was actually doing this, taking the first step toward unraveling the mystery of her past. "Ms. Clark?" The voice of the receptionist broke through her thoughts. "They're ready for you." Isabella stood and followed the woman down a narrow hallway to a small office. Inside, a social worker sat behind a desk, her expression kind but professional. "Thank you for coming in," the woman said, motioning for Isabella to sit. "How can I help you today?" Isabella swallowed hard, her mouth dry. I'm looking for information about my adoption," she began, her voice shaky. "I was adopted as a baby, and I don't know anything about my biological parents. But recently, someone came forward. Someone who thinks I might be related to them." The social worker nodded, her face sympathetic. "I understand. We'll do everything we can to help you. Do you have any documents from the adoption that you could share with us?" Isabella reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope she had found at home, handing it over with trembling hands. The woman took it and began to look through the papers, her eyes scanning the documents with practiced ease. After a few moments, she frowned, her brow furrowing slightly. "It seems there's very little information here," she said. "Your adoption was handled privately, which can make things more complicated. But I'll do my best to look into it." Isabella nodded, feeling a knot of tension tighten in her stomach. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud made everything feel more real, more daunting. The social worker continued to flip through the papers, pausing at a handwritten note tucked inside. "This is unusual," she muttered, more to herself than to Isabella. "What is it?" Isabella asked, leaning forward. The woman held up the note, her expression now serious. "It's a message from someone involved in the adoption process. It says that your biological mother specifically requested anonymity, and that the adoption was arranged to ensure that no trace of her identity could be found." Isabella's heart sank. "So there's no way to find out who she was?" The social worker looked up at her, her eyes softening. "It's not impossible, but it will be difficult." Isabella nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had come here hoping for answers, but instead, it seemed like the mystery of her past was only deepening. As she left the office, stepping back into the cold air of the city, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stop now. The truth was out there, somewhere, and she had to find it, no matter how painful or complicated it might be. And the only person who seemed to hold any answers was Oliver Reed. Isabella's footsteps echoed softly as she walked along the quiet street, her breath visible in the cool afternoon air. The weight of the social worker's words still hung heavily on her mind. Her biological mother had specifically requested to remain anonymous, and the adoption had been designed to leave no trace. It felt like the door to her past had been slammed shut just as she had begun to knock. But she couldn't turn back now. She had come too far. And despite the lack of concrete answers at the adoption agency, there was still one person who might know the truth: Oliver. Her phone buzzed in her pocket as she neared the cafe where they had agreed to meet. Oliver had called her earlier, his voice calm but insistent, asking if they could talk. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever this conversation would bring, but she knew it had to happen. She needed answers, and he was the only one who might be able to provide them. As Isabella approached the cafe, she spotted Oliver sitting by the window, his tall frame hunched over a cup of coffee. He looked different in the daylight, less imposing than he did in the dim, elegant light of the restaurant where she worked. Now, he looked more like a man weighed down by his own questions and regrets. Isabella hesitated for a moment, standing just outside the cafe door. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a brief second, she considered turning around and leaving, pretending this whole strange situation had never happened. But she knew that wouldn't solve anything. She had to face this. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and walked in. Oliver glanced up as she approached, his eyes softening when he saw her. He stood up, almost awkwardly, as if he didn't know whether to greet her formally or familiarly. Instead, he simply motioned for her to sit down. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, sitting back down across from her. Isabella nodded, pulling off her coat and draping it over the back of her chair. "I almost didn't," she admitted, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "But I need to understand what's going on." Oliver exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath, waiting for this moment. He looked at her, the lines of worry etched into his face, making him appear older than he was. "I know this is overwhelming," he said gently, his hands resting on the table. "It's overwhelming for me too. But I've been thinking a lot since the first time I saw you. And I believe there's a reason for all of this." Isabella stared at him, her mind still reeling from the events of the past week. "You believe I'm your daughter," she said, more as a statement than a question. Oliver nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, I don't have proof, at least, not yet. But everything points to that possibility. The way you look, the timing, the secrecy around your adoption, it all fits." Isabella felt her throat tighten. She had come here prepared to hear him out, but hearing it so plainly, so directly, hit her harder than she expected. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could something like this happen? Why wouldn't my birth mother have told you?" Oliver leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I don't know for certain, but I have a theory. Victoria, my wife, she was complicated. She kept a lot from me, especially toward the end. There were things happening in our lives, things I wasn't fully aware of, and after she died, I discovered just how much she had hidden." He paused, searching Isabella's face, as if gauging how much she could handle hearing. "I think," he continued carefully, "that she may have been pregnant when we were going through some very difficult times. She might have thought that keeping the baby secret, keeping you secret, was the only way to protect you." Isabella shook her head, struggling to process what he was saying. "Protect me from what?" "There were enemies," Oliver said, his voice tightening. "People who wanted to hurt me, hurt us. Victoria was afraid, I think, and she made decisions I didn't understand at the time. The night of the fire when she died, I always believed there was more to it, but I didn't know what, and I couldn't prove anything. Now, with you standing here, I think I might finally understand." Isabella's heart pounded as the pieces slowly began to fall into place. The fire, the tragedy that had taken Victoria's life. Could that have been the reason her biological mother, Victoria had kept her a secret? Was she protecting her from something or someone dangerous? "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm saying that if Victoria was your mother," Oliver replied, his voice thick with emotion, "she may have given you up to keep you safe. And if that's the case, then the people who wanted to hurt us might still be out there. You could have been their target, just like she was." The room seemed to spin around Isabella as she tried to comprehend the gravity of Oliver's words. This wasn't just about discovering her biological family anymore. This was about something much darker, something that had been lurking in the shadows of her past all along. Isabella swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Do you have any proof? Anything that could link me to Victoria?" Oliver hesitated, his face conflicted. "Not yet, but I'm working on it. I've hired someone to dig deeper into the adoption records, and I'm hoping we'll find something that can connect the dots. It's only a matter of time." Isabella leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had come here looking for answers, but now it seemed like the questions were only multiplying. Could she really be the daughter of this man? And if so, was she in danger, just like her birth mother had been? She looked at Oliver, seeing the desperation in his eyes. He wanted this to be true, she realized. He wanted her to be his daughter, to fill the void that Victoria's death had left in his life. But Isabella wasn't sure if she was ready to fill that role, or if she ever could. "I need time," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Oliver nodded, understanding. "Of course. I'm not asking you to accept anything right away. But please, don't walk away from this. We both need to know the truth." Isabella stood up slowly, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "But I don't know if I can handle this right now." "I understand," Oliver said, standing as well. "But when you're ready, I'll be here. And I'll keep looking for answers in the meantime." Isabella nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. She turned and walked out of the cafe, her steps slow and unsteady, as if each one carried the weight of the world. Outside, the city bustled around her, oblivious to the storm of emotions raging inside her. She didn't know where to go from here. She didn't know who she was anymore. But one thing was clear. Her life had changed, and there was no going back. The cold wind whipped through the trees as Isabella walked, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her mind still reeling from her conversation with Oliver. The streets of New York, usually so familiar, felt foreign to her now. She wandered without direction, her thoughts swirling with too many questions and no clear answers. Could this really be true? She wondered for the 100th time. Was it possible that she, Isabella Clarke, the adopted daughter of a normal, loving couple, was actually the daughter of a woman like Victoria Reed, the wife of a powerful man, part of a world filled with danger and secrets? The weight of it all was crushing. She had always known there were gaps in her past, unanswered questions about her birth parents, but she had never imagined anything like this. It was too much, too overwhelming. After what felt like hours of walking, Isabella found herself standing in front of her small apartment building. The familiar sight of it, with its worn bricks and ivy climbing the walls, grounded her just a little. She took a deep breath and walked inside, hoping that the quiet of her home would help her find some clarity. But as she stepped into her apartment, the stillness only made her mind race more. She sat down on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. Oliver's voice echoed in her head, replaying everything he had told her. Asterisk, if Victoria was your mother, she may have given you up to protect you. There were people who wanted to hurt us. She might have been trying to save your life, asterisk. Isabella ran a hand through her hair, trying to process it all. Could her birth mother really have given her up to shield her from some kind of threat? It sounded like something out of a movie, not real life. And yet, the way Oliver had spoken, the emotion in his voice, it was hard to dismiss. He believed it. He believed that she was his daughter, that she had been caught up in something far beyond her understanding. Isabella pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the screen. She wanted to call someone, to talk to someone about everything that had just happened. But who could she tell? Her adoptive parents didn't know anything, and she wasn't ready to burden them with this, at least, not yet. Her finger hesitated over the number for her best friend, Chloe, but she couldn't bring herself to dial it. What would she say? How could she explain any of this without sounding crazy? With a frustrated sigh, she tossed the phone onto the couch and buried her face in her hands. She had always been good at solving her own problems, at staying level-headed no matter what life threw at her. But this was something entirely different. The next morning, Isabella woke with a start, the events of the previous day flooding back to her as soon as she opened her eyes. She had barely slept, her mind unable to rest with so many questions swirling in her head. She knew she couldn't continue like this, stuck in a state of limbo, unsure of what to believe or where to go next. She sat up, pushing the covers off her legs, and stared at the sunlight streaming in through the window. The city outside her window was alive with the usual sounds of traffic and people hurrying to start their day. But inside her apartment, it was quiet, too quiet. Suddenly, she knew what she needed to do. She needed to confront the past head-on, to stop hiding from the truth. The answers wouldn't just come to her. She had to find them. Her decision made, she quickly got dressed, pulling on a sweater and jeans, and grabbed her phone. Without hesitating this time, she dialed Oliver's number. It rang twice before he answered. Isabella? His voice sounded uncertain, as if he hadn't expected her to call so soon. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice firm, "but not over the phone. Can we meet somewhere?" "Somewhere private." Oliver paused for a moment, then replied, "Of course. Where do you want to meet?" Isabella thought for a second. "There's a small park near the west side of the city. It's quiet, and no one will bother us there. Can you meet me in an hour?" "I'll be there," Oliver said, his voice steady. Isabella hung up, her heart pounding. She had no idea what she was going to say when they met, but she knew that she couldn't keep running from this. She had to know the truth, even if it scared her. The park was peaceful when Isabella arrived. Tall trees surrounded the area, their leaves rustling gently in the wind. A narrow path wound its way through the greenery, leading to a small bench near a pond. She sat down, her legs shaky, and waited. It wasn't long before she saw Oliver walking toward her, his coat flapping slightly in the breeze. He looked tense, his face drawn and serious, but he gave her a small nod as he approached. "Thank you for meeting me," Isabella said quietly as he sat down beside her on the bench. Oliver nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I'm glad you called. I've been thinking about everything, and I want to help you find the answers, whatever they may be." Isabella stared out at the pond, watching as a few ducks paddled lazily across the water. "I went to the adoption agency yesterday," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's almost nothing in the records. No names, no details. Just a blank space where my history should be." Oliver sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "That doesn't surprise me. If Victoria really did give you up to protect you, she would have made sure it was impossible to trace. She was meticulous about things like that." Isabella looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why didn't you know? If she was pregnant, why didn't she tell you?" Oliver's expression tightened. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "We were going through a lot at the time. I was dealing with threats, business problems. Victoria was distant, and I thought it was because of everything we were facing. I didn't realize she was hiding something this big from me. I should have known. I should have been there for her." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with guilt. Isabella could see the pain in his eyes, the regret that seemed to weigh on him. She wanted to be angry at him, to blame him for the uncertainty in her life, but she couldn't. He had lost someone too. He had been in the dark just as much as she had. "So what do we do now?" she asked, her voice softer. Oliver turned to her, his expression resolute. "We keep digging. I've hired a private investigator, James. He's one of the best. He's already looking into your adoption records. But now that we know how carefully Victoria orchestrated everything, we need to look deeper." Isabella nodded, feeling a small glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this. Whatever answers they found, they would face them together. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Oliver reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch light but reassuring. "So am I," he said quietly. "But we'll get through this. We'll find out the truth." Isabella looked at him, feeling a strange sense of connection to this man she had only just met. It wasn't just the possibility that they shared blood. It was something deeper, something that felt like an unspoken understanding between them. She took a deep breath, the weight of the unknown still pressing down on her, but now it felt just a little lighter. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's find out the truth." The following days passed in a haze for Isabella. She tried to keep herself busy with work, but her mind was constantly drifting back to the looming uncertainty about her origins. Every shift at the restaurant felt heavier now, knowing that Oliver was out there, uncovering details about a past she wasn't sure she wanted to confront. She found herself waking up each morning with a sense of dread, wondering if today would be the day everything changed. What if the truth was even worse than she imagined? What if she found out things about her birth mother, about Victoria, that she wasn't ready to handle? But despite the fear, she couldn't turn away. She had agreed to work with Oliver, to dig deeper into the mystery of her adoption, and part of her longed for the closure she had never realized she needed. One evening, while she was wiping down tables after the dinner rush, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, half expecting a message from Oliver. Instead, it was from James, the private investigator. "Need to talk. Urgent." Call me. Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly glanced around the restaurant to make sure no one needed her, then hurried into the back hallway and dialed the number. Isabella, it's James, came the voice on the other end after the first ring. What did you find? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anticipation and fear. There was a pause before he spoke. I've been looking into Victoria's history and your adoption. Some of the details were buried deep, but I managed to find something. It's not pretty. Isabella's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Your adoption wasn't as straightforward as it seemed, James said carefully. It was arranged under the table, through channels that are, let's just say, not entirely legal. There's evidence that suggests your biological mother, Victoria, wasn't just hiding you from someone. She was hiding you from everyone. Isabella's mind raced. Why? Who was she hiding me from? James hesitated again, as if weighing how much to reveal. It looks like Victoria was involved in something dangerous toward the end of her life. I don't know all the details yet, but I've found connections to a man named Anton Varga, a known criminal with ties to international arms dealing. Victoria was in contact with him just before the fire that killed her. Isabella's blood ran cold. Arms dealing? Her biological mother had been involved with someone like that? I don't understand, she whispered. Why would she? I don't have all the answers yet, James interrupted, his voice steady. But I think Victoria was caught up in something much bigger than she anticipated. There's a chance she was trying to get out, and that's why she arranged for your adoption in secret. She knew someone was after her, and she wanted to make sure they never found you. Isabella leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a dark cloud. Does Oliver know about this? She asked, her voice barely audible. Not yet, James replied. I wanted to tell you first. You deserve to know before anyone else. She closed her eyes, her breath shaky. Her entire life had been a lie, shaped by the actions of a woman she had never known. A woman who had been living in fear, tangled up in a world of criminals and danger. And now, all of that was seeping into Isabella's life, threatening to drag her into a nightmare she wasn't sure she could escape. Is there anything else? Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Not yet, but I'm still digging. There's more to this story. I can feel it. I'll let you know as soon as I find out anything else. Thank you, Isabella whispered before hanging up. She stood there in the dim hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of everything threatening to crush her. She had asked for the truth, and now it was starting to unravel before her. But it wasn't the truth she had been expecting. That night, Isabella lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep refused to come. Her mind kept racing with thoughts of Victoria, of the secrets she had kept, and of the danger that still seemed to linger in the shadows of her past. She wanted to talk to someone, to unload the weight of it all, but the only person who might understand was Oliver, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face him just yet. The next morning, she woke with a sense of determination. She couldn't stay stuck in this limbo any longer. She needed to know more. She needed to confront Oliver with what she had learned, and they needed to figure out what to do next, together. Isabella called him early, her voice firm despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. We need to meet. There's something you need to know. Oliver agreed to meet her at his office, and a few hours later, Isabella found herself standing outside the towering glass building where Oliver's company operated. She had never been here before, and the sight of it, the sleek, modern architecture, the power it exuded, only made her more nervous. When she entered the lobby, the receptionist greeted her warmly, clearly expecting her. Mr. Reed is waiting for you, the woman said, gesturing toward the elevators. Isabella thanked her and stepped inside, her heart racing as the elevator climbed to the top floor. When the doors slid open, she was greeted by a wide, airy space filled with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Oliver stood near his desk, looking out at the skyline, but he turned as soon as she stepped in. Isabella, he said, his expression tense. What's going on? Isabella walked toward him, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to speak. I heard from James last night, she said quietly. He found something. Something about Victoria. Oliver's face hardened. What did he find? She swallowed, her voice shaking as she recounted what James had told her. Victoria was in contact with a man named Anton Varga, a criminal. It looks like she was caught up in something dangerous, and she might have arranged my adoption because she was trying to protect me. She knew someone was after her. For a moment, Oliver didn't speak. He stood frozen, his eyes darkening as the reality of her words sank in. "Varga," he said finally, his voice low. "I know that name. He's dangerous, ruthless. Victoria never mentioned him to me. I had no idea." Isabella nodded, her throat tight. "I think she was trying to keep you safe too." Oliver exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe this. I knew there was more to her death, but I didn't know it went this deep. If Varga was involved, then this isn't just about the past anymore. If he finds out you exist..." Isabella's stomach dropped. "You think I'm in danger?" Oliver's face was grim. "I don't know, but we can't take any chances. If Varga is still out there, and if he finds out about you, he might come after you. Just like he did with Victoria." The air in the room felt thick, charged with the weight of the revelation. Isabella's mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what Oliver was saying. She had come looking for answers, but now, it seemed like those answers had opened a door to something far darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Oliver stepped closer, his expression determined. "We find out everything. We expose the truth, no matter how deep this goes. And we make sure that if Varga is still out there, he can't hurt you." "I won't let that happen." Isabella stared at him, a surge of emotion rising inside her. She wasn't alone in this anymore. Whatever danger lay ahead, she and Oliver would face it together. "Okay," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear. "Let's finish this." The next few days were a blur of unease and tension for Isabella. Every moment felt like a countdown, the steady tick of time moving her closer to an inevitable confrontation with the dark truths of her past. Oliver had promised to protect her, but the fear that Anton Varga, or whoever was behind Victoria's death, might already know about her gnawed at her constantly. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, scanning the faces of strangers on the street, wondering if someone was watching her. Her once normal, predictable life had turned into a series of questions, all leading back to that one terrifying thought. Was she in danger? Oliver was relentless in his pursuit of answers. He spent hours in his office, meeting with James and digging deeper into the mystery that had consumed both their lives. But each new piece of information seemed to lead them further into a maze of lies and danger. It was late one evening when Isabella received a call from Oliver. His voice was tense, the kind of tension that made her stomach twist in knots. "Isabella, we found something. You need to come to my office right away." Without a second thought, she grabbed her coat and hurried out of her apartment. Her nerves were on edge, her heart pounding with every step as she made her way through the city streets. By the time she arrived at Oliver's office, her mind was racing with the possibilities of what he might have uncovered. The elevator ride up felt agonizingly slow, but when the doors finally opened, she stepped into the dimly lit office to find Oliver and James waiting for her. Their faces were grim, shadows cast by the pale glow of the city lights beyond the massive windows. "What did you find?" Isabella asked, her voice shaky as she approached them. James was the first to speak. "We've been looking into Varga's operations. He's more dangerous than we thought, Isabella. His reach goes beyond what we initially suspected. And we've confirmed that Victoria was in direct contact with him in the months before her death." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Why? Why was she involved with someone like him? Oliver stepped forward, his expression pained. "We don't know the full reason yet, but James uncovered something that might explain part of it." James nodded, pulling a file from the table and handing it to Isabella. "These are financial records. Large sums of money being transferred from one of Victoria's personal accounts. Secret accounts that even Oliver wasn't aware of, directly to Varga's people." Isabella's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. She was paying him? Why? What was she paying him for? "We think Victoria might have been blackmailed," James said carefully. "It's possible Varga had something on her. Something she was willing to pay a lot of money to keep hidden." Oliver spoke next, his voice tight. That's why she didn't tell me anything. She was protecting herself, or maybe she was protecting us. And you. Isabella stared at the papers in her hands, her mind spinning. Blackmail. Criminal dealings. It felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. So she gave me up, Isabella whispered, the pieces slowly falling into place. To keep me out of Varga's reach. Oliver nodded. That's what we believe. She knew Varga was dangerous, and if he found out about you, he could use you as leverage. She must have thought that hiding you was the only way to protect you from him. The weight of it all pressed down on her, the realization that her biological mother, Victoria, had been living in fear, tangled in a web of threats and danger, all for the sake of keeping her safe. And now, years later, that same danger was creeping back into Isabella's life. There's more, James said, his tone grim. We've learned that Varga is still active. He's been off the radar for a while, but our sources suggest he's resurfaced recently. And there's reason to believe he might know about you. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? How could he know? James exchanged a look with Oliver before answering. There's a leak somewhere. Someone close to Varga might have found out about your connection to Victoria. We're not sure how much he knows, but if he's aware of your existence, it puts you in immediate danger. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls tightening around her with each passing second. The threat wasn't some distant fear anymore. It was real. Varga was out there, and if he knew about her, there was no telling what lengths he might go to in order to use her against Oliver. What do we do? Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Oliver's expression hardened, a fierce determination in his eyes. We fight back. We're not going to let Varga or anyone else control this situation. I've already contacted security experts. We'll protect you, Isabella, but we also need to go on the offensive. We need to find out what Varga's next move is before he makes it. Isabella's heart pounded as she absorbed his words. The thought of being hunted by a man like Varga was terrifying, but there was a strength in Oliver's resolve that reassured her. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her, not after all they had discovered. James cleared his throat, bringing their attention back to him. I've also been looking into other leads connected to Varga's network. There's a chance we can trace his operations through some of his associates here in New York. If we can get to them before he does, we might be able to disrupt whatever plans he's setting in motion. Isabella nodded, though the fear still gnawed at her insides. And what about me? She asked, her voice shaking slightly. What do I do while you're working all of this out? Oliver stepped closer, his gaze steady and reassuring. You stay close to me. I've already arranged for extra security at your apartment, but I don't want you going anywhere alone until we know more. We'll keep you safe, Isabella. I promise. For a moment, Isabella's mind flashed to her adoptive parents. They had no idea any of this was happening. No idea that the daughter they had raised was connected to something so dark and dangerous. She had kept the truth from them, afraid of what it might do to their simple, peaceful lives. But now, with the threat of Varga looming over her, she wondered if they were in danger too. Should I tell my parents? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. They don't know anything about this. What if Varga finds out about them? Oliver hesitated, his expression softening. For now, I think it's best to keep them out of this. We don't want to involve them unless it's absolutely necessary. But I'll make sure security is watching their home, just in case. Isabella nodded, feeling a wave of guilt wash over her. She hated the thought of keeping her parents in the dark, but she knew Oliver was right. The less they knew, the safer they would be. As the conversation continued, Isabella realized just how deep this situation had become. What had started as a search for answers about her past had spiraled into something far more dangerous, something that could cost her everything. But now that she knew the truth, there was no turning back. She looked at Oliver, seeing the worry etched into his face, but also the strength. They were in this together, and whatever happened next, they would face it side by side. I'm ready, Isabella said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear. Whatever we have to do to stop Varga, I'm in. Oliver nodded, his expression fierce with determination. We'll stop him, Isabella. I swear we will. The air in the room seemed to shift, a sense of resolve settling over them. They didn't know what Varga's next move would be, but they weren't going to wait for him to strike. They would take control of the situation before it was too late. The tension in the air was palpable as Isabella sat in the back seat of the black SUV, her hands fidgeting in her lap. The city lights flashed past in a blur as the car weaved through New York's crowded streets, the hum of traffic a distant murmur. Seated beside her was Oliver, his face set in a grim expression, and ahead, their driver. A quiet, imposing man from the security team Oliver had hired. The vehicle felt like a moving fortress, yet Isabella couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that lingered in the pit of her stomach. It had been days since they had learned that Anton Varga might know about her, and every moment since had been filled with tension. She had stayed close to Oliver, rarely leaving his sight, and even her apartment, once her sanctuary, no longer felt safe. The added security at her home, the bodyguards who shadowed her every move, only reinforced the reality that her life had irrevocably changed. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, they were no longer just waiting for Varga to make a move. They were going after him. James had uncovered a lead. A man named Victor, one of Varga's trusted associates, had been spotted in the city. Victor was a shadowy figure, deeply embedded in Varga's network, and if they could track him down, they might finally get the information they needed to put an end to this nightmare. Isabella's mind raced as the SUV turned into a narrow street, the headlights cutting through the darkness. She had agreed to be here, to be part of this, but the fear still clung to her. She wasn't used to this world of high stakes, of criminals and secrets, and the thought of facing someone like Victor filled her with dread. But she knew she couldn't run anymore. This was her fight too. Oliver glanced at her, his voice low and reassuring. "We're almost there. You're sure you're ready for this?" Isabella met his eyes, feeling a flicker of warmth despite the cold fear gnawing at her. "I'm ready," she whispered, though her heart was pounding. "I have to be." He gave a tight nod, his hand briefly resting on hers in a gesture of comfort. "We'll get through this. Victor is our way in. Once we know what he knows, we can start dismantling Varga's network." The car slowed to a stop outside an old, nondescript building, its brick facade worn with age. There was nothing about the place that stood out, but that was the point. It was the perfect hideout for someone trying to stay off the radar. Victor had been spotted here earlier in the day, and Oliver had made the decision to move quickly, hoping to catch him before he disappeared again. The driver stepped out first, scanning the street, then opened the door for Oliver and Isabella. She hesitated for a moment before climbing out, the cool night air biting at her skin. The street was quiet, almost eerily so, and the tension in her chest tightened. Oliver's security team, 3 men dressed in dark clothing, moved swiftly around them, their eyes scanning the shadows. Isabella stayed close to Oliver, her senses heightened, every sound amplified as they approached the entrance of the building. Inside, the hallway was dimly lit, the faint buzz of a flickering light bulb overhead casting long shadows along the walls. The place smelled of dust and neglect, but there was an edge of something darker in the air, like danger lurked in every corner. "Stay behind me," Oliver said softly, his voice firm but gentle. Isabella nodded, doing as he asked, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. They moved quietly through the building, following the security team as they made their way to the 3rd floor. James had given them a location, an apartment at the end of the hall, where Victor had been seen earlier. If they were lucky, he would still be there. As they neared the door, Oliver motioned for the team to stop. One of the guards approached the door cautiously, pressing his ear against it to listen for any movement inside. After a tense moment, he glanced back at Oliver and nodded. Oliver turned to Isabella. "Stay here. Let us go in first." She opened her mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes told her that this was not the time for arguments. She nodded reluctantly and stepped back as the guards moved into position. With a swift motion, the door was pushed open, and the guards slipped inside, their movements efficient and silent. Oliver followed close behind, and Isabella held her breath, listening intently for any sounds of confrontation. For a few agonizing seconds, there was only silence. Then, muffled voices. She strained to hear, her heart racing, but the words were too quiet, too distant. A moment later, Oliver appeared at the doorway, motioning for her to come inside. Isabella stepped into the dimly lit apartment, her eyes quickly adjusting to the gloom. The space was small and cluttered, with old furniture and papers scattered across a worn-out rug. And in the center of the room, seated on a shabby armchair, was Victor. He looked up as Isabella entered, his dark eyes narrowing as he took her in. He was younger than she had expected, with short-cropped hair and a lean build, but there was something about him that radiated danger. His hands were bound with zip ties, and one of the guards stood behind him, watching him closely. "Victor," Oliver said calmly, standing near Isabella's side. "We know who you are, and we know who you work for. If you cooperate, this will be much easier for you." Victor smirked, though there was tension in his jaw. "I'm not telling you anything." Isabella's pulse quickened. She hadn't been sure what to expect, but the sheer hostility in Victor's voice sent a chill down her spine. This was a man who had no fear, at least, none that he would show. "You know who I am," Oliver continued, his tone sharp, "and you know what I'm capable of. If you don't cooperate, you'll regret it. We want information about Varga, where he is, what he's planning." Victor's smirk widened, though there was no humor in it. "Varga's already won, Reed. You think you can stop him? You're too late." A cold wave of fear washed over Isabella at his words. Too late? What did that mean? Was Varga already making his move? Oliver's expression darkened, but he remained calm. "We'll see about that. But if you want to avoid being part of his downfall, you'll help us." For a long moment, Victor said nothing, his eyes flickering between Oliver and Isabella. There was a darkness in his gaze, a cruel amusement that made her skin crawl. She knew he was testing them, waiting to see how far they were willing to go. Finally, Victor leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a low, mocking whisper. "You're not the only one he's coming for, you know? He knows about her." Isabella's heart froze. Oliver's entire body went rigid beside her. "What did you just say?" Victor's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with malicious glee. "He knows about the girl, about your precious daughter. And when he's done with you, he'll come for her." The room seemed to spin around Isabella as Victor's words sank in. She could feel her pulse racing in her ears, her chest tightening with panic. Varga knew. He knew about her. Oliver's voice, sharp with barely contained fury, cut through the haze of fear. "You're lying." Victor chuckled darkly. "Believe what you want. But you're already dead, Reed. You and your little family." Oliver stepped forward, his fists clenched, but one of the guards quickly intervened, holding him back before the situation could escalate. Isabella watched in horror, her mind reeling with the implications of Victor's words. Varga was coming for them. He knew everything. She felt Oliver's hand on her shoulder, steadying her, but the terror inside her was overwhelming. They had been trying to get ahead of Varga, but now it seemed he was already ahead of them. And worse, he was targeting her. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Isabella realized just how deep the danger ran. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about survival. "Take him away," Oliver ordered, his voice strained but controlled. "We'll deal with him later." The guards moved swiftly, dragging Victor from the room, but his mocking laughter echoed in Isabella's ears long after he was gone. Isabella turned to Oliver, her voice shaking. "What do we do now?" Oliver looked at her, his eyes hard with resolve. "We prepare for the worst. We don't have a choice." And as they stood together in the dim apartment, the gravity of what was coming began to sink in. Varga wasn't just a shadow from the past anymore. He was a storm barreling toward them, and there was no turning back. The fight for their lives had begun. The night was eerily quiet. Isabella sat in Oliver's office, the heavy silence between them filled with a tension neither of them could shake. Outside, the city's lights twinkled like stars, but tonight, they offered no comfort. The threat of Anton Varga loomed large over everything, a dark cloud that refused to lift. After Victor's taunting words, they had moved quickly, fortifying their security, contacting law enforcement, and preparing for what felt like the inevitable. But no matter how many precautions they took, the fear remained. Isabella knew Varga was out there, lurking in the shadows, and the thought of what he might do if he found her kept her on edge. Oliver sat across from her, his face drawn and tense. He had always been a man of control, always sure of his next move. But now, there was a vulnerability in him that Isabella had never seen before. He had promised to protect her, but deep down, they both knew that Varga's reach was vast, and his ruthlessness knew no bounds. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. James had sent updates throughout the day, pieces of information about Varga's movements, his network of associates, but nothing concrete, nothing that gave them an upper hand. They were waiting, and with each passing minute, the weight of that waiting grew unbearable. Isabella could feel her pulse in her throat, the anxiety building with every breath. She glanced at Oliver, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we can't stop him?" Oliver's gaze softened as he looked at her, his hand reaching out to gently cover hers on the desk. "We will," he said, his voice firm. "We have to." But even as he said the words, Isabella could hear the uncertainty behind them. They both knew that this was a battle against time, and Varga was moving faster than they were. The thought of him finding her, of him finding her parents, was a constant terror that gnawed at her insides. Then, just as the silence became unbearable, Oliver's phone rang. The sound cut through the stillness like a knife, and both of them jolted. Oliver answered it quickly, his voice steady despite the tension in his face. "James." Isabella watched as Oliver listened, his expression tightening with every word. Her heart raced, her stomach churning with dread. She could only hear one side of the conversation, but she knew from Oliver's reaction that it wasn't good news. When he finally hung up, the room felt colder, the air thick with the weight of what was coming. "He's making his move," Oliver said quietly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Varga's men have been spotted near the city. They're closing in." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. "Here? In New York?" Oliver nodded, his jaw clenched. "He knows where you are, Isabella. He's coming for you." The words sent a chill down her spine, and for a moment, the fear threatened to overwhelm her. But then she saw the determination in Oliver's eyes, the fierce protectiveness that had driven him from the beginning. He wasn't going to let Varga take her. He wasn't going to let him win. "We're not running," Oliver said firmly. "We're going to face him head-on." Isabella swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, the reality of it felt crushing. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for her family, for the truth, for everything she had ever known. And yet, despite the fear, there was a part of her that felt stronger than it had before. She had been thrown into a world of danger and secrets, but she wasn't the same woman she had been when this all started. She was ready to fight. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. Oliver stood, his presence commanding as he moved to the window, staring out at the city below. "We've secured the building," he said, his voice calm but full of resolve. "Varga's men won't get to you. Not here. James is working with law enforcement. They're moving in on Varga's location as we speak." Isabella nodded, though the thought of sitting here, waiting for the storm to hit, made her stomach churn. "What about you?" she asked quietly. "Are you safe?" Oliver turned to her, his expression softening. "I'm not leaving your side," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, we face it together." His words filled her with a warmth she hadn't expected, a sense of reassurance that she clung to. No matter how dark things had become, she wasn't alone. Oliver was here, fighting with her, and together, they would face whatever was coming. The hours stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity as they waited. Isabella could hear the sounds of the security team moving through the building, the occasional radio chatter as they coordinated with the police. The tension in the air was suffocating, but there was no turning back now. And then, the silence was broken. A sudden commotion echoed from the lower floors, a thudding sound, followed by voices raised in alarm. Isabella's heart raced as she looked at Oliver, her breath catching in her throat. "They're here," he said quietly, his face pale but determined. Before she could respond, the door to the office burst open, and one of the security guards rushed in, his face grim. "Mr. Reed, we've got movement on the ground floor. Varga's men are inside." Isabella's blood turned to ice. They were out of time. Oliver's eyes locked onto hers, his expression filled with an intensity that both frightened and reassured her. "Stay close to me," he said firmly, grabbing her hand and pulling her to her feet. "We're getting out of here." The next few minutes were a blur of motion and adrenaline. The security team led them through the building, moving swiftly down a series of back hallways and emergency exits. Every sound made Isabella flinch. Every shadow seemed to hold the promise of danger. As they neared the exit, the tension reached its peak. The guards moved ahead, clearing the way, but the air was thick with the threat of violence. They could hear footsteps approaching, closer, faster, and Isabella's heart pounded in her chest. Suddenly, the door ahead of them crashed open, and two men appeared, their faces hard and cold. Vargas' men. The security team reacted instantly, but Isabella felt herself pulled back, Oliver shielding her with his body as chaos erupted around them. Gunshots echoed in the narrow hallway, the sound deafening, but Isabella barely registered it. Her entire world had shrunk to the space between her and Oliver, to the fierce grip of his hand on hers as they moved, his body a shield against the violence erupting around them. The minutes felt like hours, but eventually, the gunfire subsided, and the security team led them out into the cool night air. Isabella's breath came in short, ragged gasps, her entire body trembling with adrenaline. They were safe. For now. James appeared from the shadows, his face tense but relieved. "We've got him," he said quickly. "Vargas been taken into custody. It's over." Isabella blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. It's over. The nightmare had ended. The danger was gone. Oliver pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in a fierce, protective embrace. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself relax. The fear, the uncertainty, it was finally slipping away. She pulled back slightly, looking up at Oliver, her eyes searching his. "It's really over?" He nodded, his voice soft. "It's over." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes, a flood of emotion she had been holding back for days, and she let herself cry. Tears of relief, of exhaustion, of finally being free. Oliver's arms tightened around her, his voice a whisper in her ear. "You're safe now. We're safe." And for the first time in a long time, Isabella believed him. They stood together in the quiet of the night, the world around them still, the storm that had nearly consumed them finally passing. There was a long road ahead, questions still unanswered, wounds still healing, but for now, they had each other. And that was enough. The past had been dark, filled with secrets and danger, but the future, finally, felt like a promise of something better.